Washington, A Life, by Ron Chernow. Podcast script. Introduction. Host the wise storyteller. Picture a young man, just 23 years old, standing on a riverbank in the heart of the American wilderness. The air is thick with smoke and the chilling echoes of gunfire. All around him, trained British soldiers, the most formidable army in the world, are breaking ranks, throwing down their weapons, and fleeing in blind panic like sheep before the hounds, as he would later write. 2 horses have been shot out from under him, and 4 bullets have ripped through his coat, yet he remains untouched, a lone figure of impossible calm in a storm of chaos. He is not a seasoned general. He is a provincial colonel, an outsider, a young man burning with an ambition he can barely conceal. He had warned his commander, General Braddock, that the frontier did not play by European rules, but his advice was dismissed. Now, Braddock lies dying, and the full weight of this disastrous defeat, a defeat that will echo across continents, is falling squarely on the shoulders of this young Virginian. His name is George Washington. What forges a man like that? How does a person who felt the sting of having a defective education become the most revered figure of his time? How does someone who wrestled his entire life with a ferocious temper transform himself into a symbol of perfect self-control? And how does this seemingly reserved, even aloof, figure inspire a ragged army and a fledgling nation to achieve the impossible? Welcome to the Billionaire's Bookshelf. I am your guide, and today, we are opening a book that answers these questions with breathtaking clarity. Ron Chernow's Pulitzer Prize-winning masterpiece, Washington, A Life. Ron Chernow is more than a historian. He is a master portraitist of character. He began his career not as a historian, but as a student of English literature, learning the art of narrative before he ever turned to the archives. From the banking dynasties of the House of Morgan to the titan of industry John D. Rockefeller, Chernow has dedicated his life to penetrating the silences of famously reserved people, to understanding the inner lives of those who shaped our world. It was his biography of another founder, Alexander Hamilton, that inspired the Broadway sensation. But it was in writing about Hamilton that Chernow had an epiphany. He realized that to truly understand the birth of America, he had to understand the man at its very center. This book is the result of that quest. It's not just a history, it is an intimate journey into the mind and soul of George Washington. And I promise you, by the end of our time together, you will see this man not as a marble statue or a face on a dollar bill, but as a living, breathing, and profoundly human leader who struggled, failed, and ultimately triumphed against impossible odds. You will discover the secret to his leadership, a secret that lies not in perfection, but in a lifelong, relentless dedication to self-improvement. And you will understand why his story is not just the story of America's beginning, but a timeless lesson in how character is forged and how a single life, lived with purpose, can change the world. Book summary. My dear young friend, if you want to understand a great person, you must start not with their triumphs, but with their struggles. For George Washington, the first and greatest struggle was with himself. Contemporaries who were fooled by his calm command saw a man of stone. But those who knew him best, like the painter Gilbert Stuart, saw something entirely different. Stuart believed that if Washington had been born in the wild forests, he would have been the fiercest of all savages. He saw in Washington's face the marks of the strongest and most ungovernable passions. And he was right. Thomas Jefferson said that when Washington's temper finally broke its bonds, he was most tremendous in wrath. This was the central paradox of the man, a deeply emotional, passionate soul trapped inside a body that he trained, with iron discipline, to be an unmoving monument of composure. The story of his life is the story of that battle. It began in a world that seems impossibly distant now, in the Tidewater region of Virginia, a land of sprawling tobacco fields and a strict social hierarchy. His family, the Washingtons, were respectable but not at the top. They were what you might call second-tier gentry, with enough land and slaves to be comfortable, but always looking up at the great planter families, the Fairfaxes, the Carters, with a mix of envy and aspiration. This position gave young George a restless energy, a burning desire to prove himself, to climb higher. His world was shattered when he was just 11. His father, Augustine, a strong, raw-boned man, died suddenly after riding out in a storm. This loss cast a long shadow. It robbed George of the chance for a formal European education, the kind his older half-brothers, Lawrence and Augustine Jr., had received. This defective education, as he called it, would be a source of insecurity his entire life. It also threw him into the orbit of his mother, Mary Ball Washington, a woman who was a force of nature in her own right. Mary was a tough, unbending, and deeply anxious woman. She rarely offered praise and seemed almost resentful of her son's ambitions, as if his desire to make a name for himself was a personal betrayal to her. When 14-year-old George had a chance to join the Royal Navy, a dream for any ambitious colonial boy, his mother gave her approval, only to snatch it away at the last minute, killing the opportunity. It was the first of many times she would try to hold him back, measuring his worth not by what he could achieve, but by what he could provide for her. Dealing with this difficult woman taught George a powerful lesson in self-control. He learned to master his temper, to hold his tongue, and to retreat into a polite, formal silence. He became a master of his own emotions because he was terrified of what would happen if he ever lost control of them. This struggle was the crucible where his famous Stoic personality was forged. With his path to a classical education blocked, George turned to the world of action and found a mentor in his older half-brother, the dashing and sophisticated Lawrence. Lawrence had served as a captain in the British military and returned with thrilling tales of war. He married into the Fairfax family, the most powerful clan in Virginia, and through this connection, young George was introduced to a world of unparalleled wealth and influence at their magnificent estate, Belvoir. It was here that his life's great ambition took shape. He didn't want to just be a farmer, he wanted to be a gentleman, a man of standing, a soldier. He studied the manners of his social betters, meticulously copying 110 rules of civility and decent behavior to polish his rough country edges. He learned to dance, to ride with unmatched grace, and to present himself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. His first real adventure came at 16, when he joined a surveying expedition into the wilds of the Shenandoah Valley. This was a world away from the refined drawing rooms of Belvoir. He slept in smoky tents, forded raging rivers, and learned to endure hardship with a quiet resilience that would define him. But more than that, this journey westward ignited in him a lifelong fascination with the vast, untamed continent. He began to see America not as a collection of coastal colonies, but as a future empire. This ambition soon found its outlet in the military. In 1753, at the age of just 21, he was entrusted by Virginia's governor, Robert Dinwiddie, with a perilous mission, to travel deep into the Ohio country and deliver an ultimatum to the French to abandon their forts on what the British considered their land. It was a journey that nearly killed him. He was shot at by a hostile guide, capsized into an icy river, and forced to hike through a blizzard. But he returned not just with a defiant message from the French, but with a detailed journal of his journey that was published in both the colonies and London, giving the young, unknown Virginian his first taste of international fame. The world was now on a collision course, and Washington was at its center. The following year, he was sent back to the Ohio frontier, this time with a small force of Virginian troops. It was in a secluded glen in May of 1754 that his life, and the history of the world, took a dramatic turn. Convinced a small French detachment was spying on him, Washington, along with his Indian allies, launched a surprise attack. The skirmish was over in 15 minutes, But among the dead was a French ensign named Jumonville, who was carrying a diplomatic message. The French called it an assassination. The English called it a victory. Sir Horace Walpole in London would later say that this volley fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods of America set the world on fire. It was the opening shot of what would become the 7 Years' War, a global conflict between Britain and France. Washington, now a colonel, quickly built a crude stockade he called Fort Necessity. He was soon surrounded by a much larger French force, and on a day of torrential rain, with his men's gunpowder soaked and useless, he was forced to surrender. In the surrender document, written in French and poorly translated, Washington inadvertently signed a confession admitting to the assassination of Jumonville. He returned to Virginia a hero to some, a reckless fool to others, but he had learned a brutal lesson in frontier warfare and the sting of public controversy. His greatest military education, however, came the following year, when he served as a volunteer aide to the British General Edward Braddock on a massive expedition to capture the French Fort Duquesne. Braddock was a textbook European general, brave, arrogant, and utterly dismissive of the colonists and their irregular style of fighting. Washington tried to warn him about the danger of Indian ambushes, but Braddock scoffed, "These savages may be a formidable enemy to your raw American militia, but upon the King's regular and disciplined troops, sir, it is impossible they would make any impression." On the banks of the Monongahela River, Braddock's army walked straight into the trap Washington had feared. Hidden in the trees, French and Indian forces unleashed a devastating fire. The British regulars, trained to fight in open fields, were thrown into chaos. They fired wildly, sometimes at their own men, and then broke and ran. Washington, though weakened by a terrible bout of dysentery, rode all over the battlefield, relaying orders, rallying the retreating troops, and showing an almost supernatural courage under fire. He emerged from that massacre as one of its few heroes, his reputation for bravery now legendary. But he also took away a powerful insight: the invincible British Army could be defeated. It was a lesson that would one day change the course of history. After the Braddock disaster, Washington was made commander of all Virginia's forces, tasked with the impossible job of defending a 350-mile frontier against brutal raids. For 5 years, he dealt with the harsh realities of military life: undisciplined recruits, inadequate supplies, and meddling politicians. He clashed constantly with British authorities over the inferior rank and pay given to colonial officers, a series of slights that stoked a slow-burning resentment inside him. More than anything, he craved a royal commission in the British Army, a symbol of acceptance and respectability, but it was a prize that always eluded him. The British Empire simply had no place for a man of his talent and ambition. During these long, frustrating years on the frontier, Washington learned to be more than just a soldier. He became a leader. He learned how to impose discipline, how to manage men, and how to navigate the treacherous world of politics. The man who had been so rash at Fort Necessity became a more patient, more calculating commander. But the military was not his only ambition. In 1759, he married a wealthy and charming widow, Martha Dandridge Custis. The marriage was a turning point. It didn't just bring him immense wealth. Martha's fortune instantly made him one of the richest men in Virginia. It gave him the stability and emotional anchor he had always craved. Martha was warm, sociable, and utterly devoted to him, the perfect partner for a man who had never known the unconditional love of his own mother. With Martha came 2 young children, Jackie and Patsy, and Washington, who would never have children of his own, embraced the role of a doting, if sometimes strict, stepfather. With his marriage, Washington entered a new phase of his life, the gentleman planter. He settled at Mount Vernon, the estate he inherited from Lawrence, and dedicated himself to transforming it into a model of scientific agriculture and refined living. He experimented with crop rotation, designed his own buildings, and managed his vast holdings with a meticulous attention to detail. He was building a world of his own, a small kingdom on the banks of the Potomac. But this kingdom was built on a foundation that would trouble him for the rest of his life: slavery. Like every other Virginia planter, Washington was a slave owner. In his early years, he bought and sold human beings like any other form of property. But the ideals of the Revolution, ideals he would come to embody, began to awaken in him a deep and profound unease. He started to see the hypocrisy of fighting for liberty while holding others in bondage. He would eventually tell a friend that he wished from his soul that the legislature of this state could see the policy of a gradual abolition of slavery. This moral struggle would become one of the great, unresolved conflicts of his life. As he settled into the life of a country squire, the world outside was changing. By the mid-1760s, Britain, staggering under the debt from the 7 Years' War, began to impose a series of taxes on the colonies: the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. To Washington, and many other colonists, this was more than an economic issue. It was a fundamental violation of their rights as Englishmen. "The Parliament of Great Britain," he wrote with rising anger, "hath no more right to put their hands into my pocket without my consent than I have to put my hands in yours for money." The quiet planter was becoming a political militant. In 1769, he introduced a plan in the Virginia legislature to boycott British goods. While he still hoped for a peaceful resolution, he was clear-eyed about the alternative. "Arms," he wrote to his friend George Mason, "should be the last resource, but he had no doubt that they should be used if necessary to defend American liberty." The final break came in 1775, after the battles of Lexington and Concord. When the Second Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia to decide the fate of the colonies, Washington arrived in a striking blue and buff military uniform. He said nothing, but his attire spoke volumes. He was ready for war. There were other, more experienced military men available. But the colonies needed more than just a general. They needed a symbol of unity. They needed a leader who could command the respect of all 13 colonies. And in that room, there was only one man who fit that description. As John Adams would say, Washington's appointment was a political necessity. On June 15, 1775, the man who had been denied a commission in the British Army was named Commander-in-Chief of the new Continental Army. He accepted the command with a genuine humility that was not an act. "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with," he told Congress. He knew the odds were impossible. He was leading a ragtag army of farmers and shopkeepers against the most powerful military force on earth. For the next 8.5 years, he would live on the edge of disaster. He faced defeat in New York, a series of humiliating retreats across New Jersey, and the brutal winter at Valley Forge, where his army was ravaged by starvation, disease, and despair. Through it all, he was the one constant, the indispensable man. He held the army together not with brilliant battlefield victories. He lost more battles than he won, but with the sheer force of his character. His men, who had once seemed to him a dirty and nasty people, became his family. He shared their hardships, felt their suffering, and earned their unwavering loyalty. There were moments of breathtaking audacity, like the surprise crossing of the Delaware River on Christmas night in 1776 to attack the Hessians at Trenton. It was a desperate gamble that paid off, a victory that revived the dying embers of the Revolution. But mostly, it was a long, grinding war of attrition. Washington's strategy was not to win, but to not lose, to keep the army in the field, to wear down the British, and to wait for a miracle. That miracle arrived in the form of the French alliance. The victory of Horatio Gates at Saratoga convinced the French that the American cause was not hopeless, and they entered the war on the side of the colonists. The final act of this long drama came in 1781 at a small tobacco port on the Virginia coast called Yorktown. Washington, in a brilliant coordination of French and American forces, trapped the main British army under Lord Cornwallis. With the French fleet blockading the sea and the Allied armies laying siege on land, Cornwallis was forced to surrender. The world was turned upside down. Even in this moment of ultimate triumph, Washington was the picture of quiet dignity. He had achieved the impossible. But as he looked ahead, he saw not the end of the struggle, but the beginning of a new one, the struggle to create a nation. The years after the war were a time of chaos. The new country, governed by the weak Articles of Confederation, was falling apart. The states bickered, the economy collapsed, and many feared that the revolution had been for nothing. Washington, who had longed for the quiet life of a farmer, watched from Mount Vernon with growing alarm. "Something must be done," he warned, "or the fabric must fall, for it is certainly tottering." He was once again called from retirement to lead his country, this time as President of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. He sat in the president's chair, a silent, presiding presence, lending his immense prestige to the creation of a new, stronger government. The delegates, in many ways, designed the presidency with him in mind, entrusting the office with great power because they knew he would be the first to hold it. When the Constitution was ratified, there was no doubt in anyone's mind who would be the first president. Washington accepted the office with the same reluctance he had shown in 1775, feeling, as he told a friend, like a culprit who is going to the place of his execution. For the next 8 years, he would face a challenge even greater than the war: to turn the words of the Constitution into a living, breathing government. As president, he was no longer just a general, he was a statesman. He created the first cabinet, with the brilliant and often clashing titans Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. He established the nation's financial system, asserted American neutrality in the face of European wars, and put down a rebellion in western Pennsylvania, proving that the new government could enforce its laws. Through it all, he was guided by a single, unwavering principle: the preservation of the Union. But the presidency took a heavy toll. He was viciously attacked in the press, accused of being a secret monarchist, and betrayed by old friends who had become his political enemies. He had grown old in the service of his country, and he longed for the peace of Mount Vernon. In 1796, he made a decision that was perhaps his most important contribution to the new republic. He voluntarily stepped down from power. In his farewell address, a timeless statement of his political wisdom, he warned his countrymen against the dangers of political factions and foreign entanglements. He had taught the young country a final, crucial lesson: in a republic, power is not held, it is passed on. He returned to Mount Vernon a living legend, the American Cincinnatus. He spent his final years as he had always wished, as a farmer, surrounded by his family. But his mind was still at work. In his final will, he made a decision he had been contemplating for years. He ordered that all of his own slaves be freed upon the death of his wife. It was his last, quiet act in the service of the liberty he had fought for his entire life. In December of 1799, after riding his horse in a cold rain and snow, he fell ill with a severe throat infection. He faced his final battle with the same calm courage he had shown his entire life. "I die hard," he told his doctors, "but I am not afraid to go." He was 67 years old. The man who had been at the center of a revolution, a war, and the creation of a new government had finally come home to rest. Commentary. So what do we take from a life like that? A life so large, so central to the story of a nation, that it's almost impossible to see the man inside the monument. I think the first thing is that greatness is not born, it is made. The young George Washington was not a genius. He was not a gifted speaker. He was an ambitious, insecure young man from the provinces, acutely aware of his own imperfections. But he possessed something more important than natural genius, an unwavering commitment to self-improvement. He was, as one historian put it, a man constructing himself. He learned from his mistakes. The impetuous young officer who blundered at Fort Necessity became the patient, calculating general who triumphed at Yorktown. The man who was once a conventional Virginia slaveholder became, in his final act, an emancipator. He never stopped growing. And that, I believe, is the heart of his secret. His leadership was not about being perfect, but about striving to be better. It was about character. He was a man of absolute integrity. In an age of intrigue and shifting loyalties, he was the one person everyone could trust. He was given immense power, as commander-in-chief, as president, because people knew he would not abuse it. His greatest act was not winning the war, but surrendering his sword, not becoming president, but stepping down. He taught the world that the true measure of a leader is not how they acquire power, but how they relinquish it. His story also teaches us something profound about the nature of freedom. Washington understood that liberty is not a gift, but a responsibility. It requires discipline, self-control, and a commitment to the common good. He feared that the young republic, intoxicated by its own freedom, might descend into anarchy. "We are either a united people," he said, "or we are 13 independent sovereignties, eternally counteracting each other." He knew that for liberty to survive, there had to be order. There had to be a nation. So how can you, a young person on the cusp of your own life, apply the lessons of George Washington? First, dedicate yourself to a lifetime of learning and self-improvement. Read widely. Study the lives of great men and women. Identify your own weaknesses and work relentlessly to overcome them. Washington's life is a testament to the power of deliberate practice and relentless self-discipline. Second, cultivate a reputation for absolute integrity. In all things, be honest, be fair, and be true to your word. Your character is the most valuable asset you will ever possess. It is the foundation upon which all real success is built. Finally, commit yourself to something larger than yourself. Washington dedicated his life to the glorious cause of American liberty. He found his purpose not in personal gain, but in public service. Find your own glorious cause. Whether it is in your community, your country, or the world, find a way to serve others. That is the path to a life of meaning and significance. That was a summary of Washington, A Life by Ron Chernow. We've touched on the major moments today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary can only take you so far. The real magic happens when you hold the book in your hands. It's in the quiet moments, when a particular story or a simple phrase connects with you in a way you didn't expect. This podcast is designed to help you decide if this book is worth your time. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity, I urge you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history, it's an experience that can genuinely change the way you see leadership, character, and the building of a nation. There's a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this journey valuable, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. That way, you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep growing together.